Hi Laida, this is Patrick. Um, so we're going to talk to each other today about our work, and I'm going to talk about an exhibition that I had at the Serpentine Gallery in London called On Venus. Um, this work at the Serpentine was really about um, pressure. It was kind of looking at um, an intensity of feeling. Something I kept sort of talking about was dysphoria as being a kind of ontological condition. It looked a lot at volatile materials, volatile liquids like acid, blood, hormones, and kind of the mutability of violence, the way that violence kind of reorders social space, reorders social norms. When you enter into the gallery, the whole space is bathed in this intense yellow, kind of acrid piss light. The floor is reflective. I learnt about it being this gunpowder storage building. What was unusual was that it was in the center of the city. Normally these types of magazines would be out, in the countryside in military bases or whatever. But this one is in the center of the city. It's in close proximity to the royal family. And the military and the police basically had it there so they knew that if they needed to, if the citizens began to riot, if there was some sort of social upheaval, the authorities had weapons and artillery and gunpowder to hand. I knew that early on I wanted to somehow turn the building inside out, and think a little or talk a little about some of the kind of corrosive capacities within our bodies, but also in art spaces, in museums, in publicly funded spaces. And it became, again, kind of early on, this desire or this logic to have the ceiling dripping. We built pipes that snake around the ceiling and down the walls, that are broken somehow, that are leaking, and they're dripping acid into the gallery space. With this project on Venus, although we have often used the shorthand architectural intervention, because there's a lack of a better word, it feels more like a kind of mutation of the space. An infected, feverish feeling, like a perversion. It's beautiful, but like wrong somehow. It's a familiar space gone wrong. Like something solid made a little less stable. And this comes from looking at the history of the building, like I said. It's also somewhat like turning the building inside out and like letting the meat of it go bad, curdling like a milk. Or, at some point I walked around the space with the gallery manager and I was trying to open up panels in the walls and being like, what does this plug do? What does this switch do? There was like a desire really early on to rip out some of those parts or to like pull the guts of the building out. But what's ended up happening instead is that these foundational elements of a building, its floor, its lighting, its walls, its temperature, its core temperament, has been stretched or widened or bent and perverted in somehow. It's like network of pipes could in theory exist within the ceiling, although they don't, and they're leaking something from the inside that's corrosive. The natural light that like shifts and changes throughout the day has become something acrid. I generally approach my work somatically. So with my own body, I would spend time in a space, watch how people move through it. But also even when writing a text, I would write to the rhythm of how I speak or what articulation looks and feels like and how syntax works. And I edit video and film in a sort of rhythm with my own body, like how often I blink, or how colour or images or sound might disorient me or unsettle me. What I'm trying to get to is that what a lot of what underpins this is a kind of ambivalent or antagonistic relationship to my own body. Um, if a practice is somatic, then it is also dysphoric. Um, and often I'm just trying to negotiate a kind of emotional and physical pain in relation to being in the world. In this show, I think it's a question that's asked first through affect, through sensation or feeling, and then gets diffused through sense and time and rhythm. But still, somehow, it's trying to get at the kind of contours of what is a valuable or a livable life, and what is deemed a livable life through sovereignty, dignity, through biopolitics, and how these conditions are framed or held or contained by our institutions. There's an argument to be made for visioning our body's vulnerabilities and porousness as a kind of radical antidote, but kind of much like queerness, I'm reluctant to suggest that this line of thinking like inherently does good, is for good, or makes for good politics. I think with On Venus, I'm trying to talk about a space where the subject itself becomes soluble, and that's as much a source of bliss as it is terror, that it could be a feeling of coming apart, of being invaded or overwhelmed or suffocated. I think that transness can be a way of problematizing the kind of distinctions between space and flesh, or psyche and architecture, and actually kind of productively risk wholeness or integrity or cohesion. And I think what's really interesting to me about kinship and trans kinship in particular, and this doesn't really feel acknowledged that often, is its like inherent resistance to order. I mean, my question is like, does kinship really behave that well at all? And I think that response comes from me being tired of the recuperative demands of being a queer artist, and like the inherent optimism that kind of shapes these recuperative and reparative moves and is often there to conceal kind of the violence of immiseration or debility. I've worked on projects like Weed Killer, a show from 2017, and On Venus, and they're both working to undo or to trouble some of the like reparative ideas that become embedded in work around identity or the body, toxicity or transness. And I think they're both also trying to seek out like difficult or sticky forms of kinship. I think what troubles the conversation around kinship, or troubles its very conception in my experience, is the way that people invariably like trample over its conceits in all directions. They kind of break the rules maybe of kinship, and this can be really, really painful, but it can also be kind of gleeful again. You end up fraternizing with the enemy, or fucking outside of the assigned orientation, or becoming chemically or sensorially bonded against the grain, and those experiences can be as conservative or negative as much as they can be transgressive. Like it goes in all directions, breaking sensible bonds. There's a kind of a giddy anarchism to pissing in your own mouth. Violence is as much about pleasure as it is about violence. It makes me think about when I was a kid and I was obsessed with running really, really hot baths, and I would stand in them and let my feet burn and have this monologue in my head where I'd try to reason with the pain, or I'd try to sort of grapple with trying to understand the difference between physical pain and mental pain and suffering, and really sort of split the conscious self from the physical self. I obviously wasn't able to articulate it like that when I was a kid, but it was just one of these strange experiments with the body. What would inevitably happen would be that either my body would adjust to the heat and I would be able to get into the bath, or the water would cool down enough for me to get into it, or I would just reach a breaking point and sort of have to get out and then start the whole experiment over again. with this show, with this project, I feel like there's something about that moment that's just held in suspension. There's no point where your body can adjust to the heat of the bath. And you just have to reckon with it or reason with it and accept that it's slowly killing you. And again, that's kind of a broader attempt at articulating something about being in the world.
Hey, Patrick. This notion of liquids, with the volatility that you see in them, us also as liquids, what we can see about ourselves in the management of them, so telling about how we also manage ourselves. I look at the material decisions, where we place that which is durable or not, the permeable and the impermeable, as a way to decipher presumptions about who might use a space, how and for what it might be used, who and what is doing a doing. Material specs and elements, from coatings to plumbing, bridge the body to the architecture and the environment beyond, making architecture and bodies into something like mutual conduits. We run through these systems and these systems run through us. Either way, these materials tell on us. Sometimes creating an ecology of that which is bodily, a loop of body and material, material to architecture, architecture to environment. Oftentimes, material and architectural elements become gatekeepers of these loops, though. They mediate the cycle, making choices about what remains permeable and what not. You remind me that architecture is nothing but liquid management, drainage, plumbing, roof incline gutters, rubber, polymers, barrels. I like the exercise of reducing buildings to an assembly of materials that manage moisture or control erosion. Reminds me that architecture's most notable and confused form of heroicism might just be its presumptions of perpetuity, its duration, its elaborate programs for preservation. It stays clinging onto this idea of forever. You tell me a story about acid rain in the news when you were a kid and thinking it would burn your skin, but later finding out that acid rain mostly affects limestone, destroying buildings, banks. Limestone institutionalism is what's mostly affected here. This is what your beautiful show gives me, the slow violence of travertine being consumed. Getting acquainted with new temporalities of degradation, erosion, and change. All your other work, too, when I first encountered it years ago when I walked into a room filled with estrogen incense, hormones, chemotherapy, poisons. You're telling us that it all runs through us, and we become made of acid. We watch ourselves do it. We do this acid onto us. I watch a show called CCTV something. It's on YouTube. It's in London. The producers clearly thought they would catch people carrying out more considered crimes, and yet the whole thing is people pissing on historic buildings. Churches near clubs and party areas really bear the brunt of their location. They're hidden nooks growing new types of moss from the combination of limestone, molly, and piss. The city keeps putting these big stone chunks and placing these medieval iron barriers to deter us. San Francisco started to paint, and I use their language here, vulnerable walls in an anti-urine paint, a paint that is rubberized and it splashes back at you when you wet it. We're trying so hard to repel us. The very mundane, the slowness of that corrosion and erosion, this ambient violence, material eating, limestone digestion, this weathering of these buildings with presumptions of perpetuity, heroic timelines, are all questioned. Last year, I did a project for a performance by composer Ash Fury at Berghain, the infamous queer club housed in an old power plant in Berlin, known for its 24/7 partying and for Laboratory, a space dedicated to gay, queer sex, also known for its absolutely no documentation policies. No installations are usually allowed here, only DJ equipment. So the space made it clear that the piece needed to belong seamlessly. So drawn to Karen Barad's ideas of interaction and entanglement, led me to interpret this as kind of wanting to create co-constitutive materials as a kind of trans condition, space, materials, body, all being kind of at once. The approach was to create a mutually implicated environment where the social, material, sonic, and physical were inseparable from one another, for good or for bad. The optional aspect of the kinship was actually reduced here. All content had implications on all else, a kind of material human ecology, an assembly of bodies and parts that would camouflage into the environment. Built out of disassemblable metal parts, not dissimilar from your metal electrical conduits, a kind of small industrial scaffolding with rubberized neoprene surfaces, protective foam cover paddings, vacuum-formed plastic elements to soften all edges, all put together with Velcro and ratchet straps, temporarily tied together, objects to objects and objects to performers, only existing together for the duration of the performance. This strappy interim methods of assembly and material palette resonated with the common happenings in this club. Sweaty, liquid, restrained fun. I think that material palettes announce the allowances of a space. Material choices render explicit the presumptions about good behavior, expected behavior. What one can do on rubber is quite different from what one can do on wood. A social materiality where specifications and the way we choose to build things anticipate their use, making the illicit explicit. But if materials can dictate behavior and express allowances, then we can also perform dissidence around these stipulations. We are the acid, and we might want to do this acid onto ourselves. In the bathrooms, single surface, bent galvanized steel rooms. The floor meets the wall, meets the toilet, meets another wall, which meets the door. Seamless, continuous, bent metal with filleted edges. It's also aware of what goes on here. All edges have continuous welds, making it into a liquid-aware environment. Water repellent, maybe watertight sometimes. Welds have been sanded and buffed for smoothness. Nothing gets caught. A small drain is located along the perimeter on the ground surface, easy to clean, a kind of hose-it-down materiality. Details tie this room to the illicit fun. Acids, sweats, dirties are all anticipated. A room in service of the physical event. What happens here can be wiped away. Beyond innuendo, the detail is explicit. I see this material coverage in your reflective surfaces, your total yellow, boys pissing in their own mouths. We do unto ourselves and we watch ourselves do it. This giddy anarchism, as you call it. In the use of reflective surfaces, high shine vinyl floors in metallic silver, HIS 025 from Harlequin floors. So we can watch it all go through us. It all runs through us. Capitalism runs through us. We turn it to acid. We piss vinegar and hormones. With it, we erode the durable walls. The shiny surfaces in your work give us the visual circulation to go with the material specification. We do watch ourselves do it.